Freedom Knows No Color, Chapter 3. As the summer wore on, the days grew hotter and more miserable. Heat seemed to rise from the cotton fields like steam from a kettle. Sometimes I wish I'd gone like Uncle Jeb did, right after we got here. Daniel groaned. The cotton was a foot high now. The fields had to be hoed again before the cotton picking season started in August. Every time I lay me down at night, Julian, I hope I don't wake up in the morning. I'm so miserable I wish I was dead. Julian knew how Daniel felt, but he had been thinking about what Uncle Jeb had told him before he died, about the man who would help them if they tried to escape. Maybe there was some truth to what Jeb had said. It won't always be like this, Daniel, Julian said. Maybe one of these days we'll do what Thomas did. He must have made it. They never brought him here, so he must have gotten through. He's probably in New Orleans now, living good. Daniel shook his head. They got Thomas. They killed him. I feel it in my bones that they killed him. He never made it to New Orleans. He's out in some swamp somewhere with the crocodiles chewing on his bones. Listen, Daniel, Julian said. I heard from Uncle Jeb that there are folks who will help us. White folks. Daniel looked at Julian as if he were crazy. There's no such thing, he said. Abolitionists are what they call themselves, Daniel, Julian explained. They don't like slavery, and they help runaway slaves. That's what Uncle Jeb said. Daniel shook his head. Never heard such nonsense in my life. Why would a white man care about slavery? No white man that I know has ever been a slave. Just keep up your spirits, Daniel, Julian said. Our time's coming. We just have to be patient. Our time's never going to come, Daniel said, his shoulders drooping. Most days now, Cyrus Cannon was in the fields, following the slaves on his bay horse. He used to whip ruthlessly. It landed on Daniel's shoulders more often than on Julian's. Julian was a better hoer than Daniel, even when the younger boy was doing his best to keep up. Cannon seemed to be singling him out for punishment. Daniel looked confused and desperate as the whip struck him again and again. Julian could stand it no longer. He pleaded for his friend. He doesn't mean to go so slow, Master Cannon. He'll go faster if you give him the chance. Anger narrowed in Cannon's eyes, making them slits in his ruddy face. I don't need advice from slaves, he said. You're forgetting your place, boy, just like Abigail said you would. Horton, take him off the row. Horton removed Julian from the row and automatically marched him over to a gum tree. He had obviously done this before. He stripped off Julian's shirt and then tied his wrists to a low-hanging branch. Then Cyrus Cannon came over carrying the whip that he never seemed to be without. I think your little remarks are worth 25 of these, he said, smacking the thick handle against one hand. One! He yelled as he slashed at Julian with the whip. Blood ran down Julian's back, and welts the size of a little finger rose up on his skin. Julian had never felt such pain. He was afraid he would die before Cannon stopped. He knew men had been whipped to death before, but he clung to the hope that he would survive. Cyrus Cannon wouldn't want to kill a valuable young slave, especially with the picking season just ahead. 25! Cannon lowered the whip and approached Julian. Don't you ever tell me how to treat my slaves, he screamed in Julian's face. Spit flew from Cannon's angry mouth, spattering Julian's cheeks. You don't tell a white man anything, do you hear? Yes, master, and no, master, is all I ever want to hear you say. Do you understand? Julian was stunned, almost speechless by the pain. Yes, master, he managed to say. In a few minutes, bleeding back and all, he was back in the row, hoeing with the others. For the next few weeks, every day was the same. Julian got up before the sun and didn't finish until the sun went down. Sometimes he didn't even finish then. On nights when the moon was full, the slaves worked in the fields until midnight. Then they did their evening chores by candlelight. In August, as harvest time approached, a kind of frenzy took over the plantation. Julian didn't know what to expect because he'd never harvested corn before. You won't be plucking pecans from trees like you did on that farm where you were, Nat warned the night before picking began. You've never seen anything like this, boy. The next morning, Julian stood in line with the other slaves while a sack was put around his neck. A strap held the sack open. The mouth of the sack was chest high, leaving the picker's hands free to pull cotton. You're going to work faster than you've ever worked before, Nat whispered from behind Julian in line. And then you're going to work faster still." Julian whispered back to Nat, "What if you don't pick as much as you can? Then they won't expect so much from you tomorrow and the next day." Nat sneered. "Every slave is expected to pick about 200 pounds. They know that, Julian. Don't ever come short of that, or you'll get the whip again. We're all tasked according to how good we are, but nobody's allowed to pick less than 200 pounds. Julian started up his row at the blazing August sun. Wide-branched trees shaded the plantation house, but the trees in the cotton fields had been cleared for years. There was nothing above the workers but the searing sun. Cyrus Cannon wore his wide-brimmed hat and rode on his bay horse, charging up and down the rows like a madman. He didn't seem to mind the perspiration steaming down his face. He didn't care that his shirt was stuck to him. He looked like a man driven by a desperate cause. His one purpose in life was to make sure that every slave worked as hard as possible. Cannon wielded his whip at anybody who stopped for even a minute. "Faster!" he screamed at Julian. "You lazy, good-for-nothing black mule! Faster, I tell you! I know you're holding back. You fill those baskets at the row's end, or you'll feel this cowhide like you never felt it before." Julian thought the day would never end. He was certain his legs would give out, or he'd drop from heat stroke. In the 10 minutes allowed for lunch, he guzzled water from the gourd and barely touched the bacon. He needed the water more than the food. He thought he could drink up a river if given the chance, and he welcomed the wooden plank waiting for him at the end of the day. Back in the rows, he forced his mind back to the Whitney farm. On a hot day like today, Ed Whitney, Howard, and the slaves would all go down the river for a swim. They'd holler and splash and ride logs in the cool water. Ed would laugh when Howard reminded him how angry Mrs. Whitney would be over the chores left undone. "That woman," Ed Whitney would laugh, "she's the bane of my life." Now Julian could almost feel the cool water bathing his weary, hot body. He felt so tired, so hot and dizzy. A slight breeze had come up, and when it blew on Julian's sweat-drenched body, it felt as if he were swimming in his own perspiration. The cotton grew 7 feet high, and each stalk had branches going out in every direction. The branches overlapped one another, making it easy to break no matter how careful the pickers were. But cotton would not bloom again on a broken branch, and that was a loss to the plantation owner. Late in the day, Daniel broke a branch. Before he hardly realized what he had done, wild curses flew from Cannon's mouth, and the whip met Daniel's back. Julian watched, stunned, as his cowering friend was punished. Julian wanted to do something. Every fiber of his being cried out for him to do something. He felt like grabbing anything that could be used as a weapon and charging at Cyrus Cannon. He imagined the old devil laying as dead and broken as the branch in the furrow. Julian knew he couldn't stand this much longer. He realized that if he continued this way, he would one day lose control and kill Cannon. Julian and Daniel continued picking the cotton with the others, filling the baskets from their sacks. Like animals, Julian thought again. It was more true every day. What can a poor, dumb animal do but plod along, suffering with nothing to hope for, with only death to end its pain? Horton called to a halt to work, and the slaves trekked towards the gin house where the cotton was weighed. Some of the slaves worried that they had picked too little. If so, a flogging awaited them. Julian was too tired and too desperate to care. But when his cotton was weighed, he had picked 250 pounds. "That's what you'll pick every day from now on," the man in the gin house said. "You must never do less." Julian carried his ponderous baskets to the cotton house, where the cotton was sorted like hay. All the slaves joined in, tramping it down to make room for more. Then, back at the log cabin, the nightly chores began. Julian went to cut wood, and Daniel to feed the hogs. After that, working by candlelight, they would prepare the next day's meal. But that night Julian decided that he and Daniel would not eat their meal there tomorrow. No breakfast in the slave quarters, no hurried lunch in the cotton fields. "Tonight," Julian whispered to Daniel as they headed out to do their chores. Daniel's eyes grew wide, but he nodded. "I trust you, Julian," was all he said. "Listen for my sign, the saving song," Julian said. Daniel nodded again. "Just do your chores as usual," Julian instructed. "We don't want to raise any suspicions." Slaves did not usually betray one another, but Julian was afraid that somebody desperate for some slight advantage might say the wrong thing. Some weary slave who longed to work at the house instead of in the fields might whisper something. Julian didn't want to risk their chances. Later, Julian lay down on the board he slept on, and Daniel did the same. Through a big crack in the opposite wall they could see the moonlight seeping in, but the sky was full of clouds that night, and Julian knew that when the clouds rolled over the moon, the boys had their best chance of fleeing. Often, one or more of the slaves would sing a saving song in the evening. It helped everyone quiet down and fall into sleep. Nobody was surprised when Julian's clear, young voice rang in the log cabin. Steal away to Jesus," Julian sang softly over the wild pounding of his heart. Steal away home." The moonlight had disappeared from the crack in the wall. It was time. Julian got up first, and Daniel followed. They headed out of the cabin and silently raced through the darkness. Julian expected a rifle to spit fire at their fleeing backs. He knew they could both be dead by the time tomorrow. Maybe long dead. But Julian now knew what freedom was. He had never had it, but he sensed what it was, and he wanted it. He wanted it desperately. Julian wanted freedom more than he wanted life.